Under the bright winter sun, an officer's taser laser shattered the peaceful silence of a quiet bakery awning. Desperate to impress wealthy investors, the arrogant cop sneered at a scarred veteran and locked his aging service dog into a cold metal cage. He pointed his weapon and practically begged the old man to fight back, looking for an excuse to permanently destroy him. Instead, the combat engineer simply knelt in the freezing snow, whispered a promise to his loyal German shepherd, and walked away in terrifying silence. The officer smirked, entirely convinced he had just crushed a powerless drifter to protect the town's luxury image. He didn't realize he had just given a master engineer the perfect reason to completely demolish a corrupt empire from the inside out. Before we watch this brilliant takedown unfold, let me know where you're watching from today, and please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Silver Creek was a town carved out of a pristine, oversized snow globe. The morning air was so crisp it practically chimed, carrying the sharp, invigorating scent of pine needles, roasted chestnuts, and distant wood smoke. It was the week of the annual Ice and Snow Festival, and the historic Victorian downtown was undergoing a magnificent metamorphosis. Massive blocks of translucent ice were being hoisted into place by cranes, ready to be sculpted into elaborate castles and mythical creatures. Fairy lights were being strung across the wrought iron lampposts, and the cobblestone streets were blanketed in a perfect, undisturbed layer of silver-white snow that reflected the brilliant Colorado winter sun. Elias Thorne stood at the edge of the bustling town square, holding a steaming paper cup of black coffee. He viewed the world not as an awestruck tourist, but through the precise, calculating lens of a structural engineer. Where others saw a magical winter wonderland, Elias analyzed the load-bearing struts of the massive wooden platforms supporting the ice blocks. He admired the clean, interlocking joinery of the temporary festival stalls, appreciating the quiet, invisible labor that held the spectacle together. He was 58 years old, though the uncompromising straightness of his spine belonged to a man 2 decades younger. Standing at 1m84, Elias possessed the dense, quiet solidity of old, weather-beaten timber. He was meticulously clean-shaven, a stark contrast to the wildly bearded mountain men who usually populated the rugged local ranges. His jawline was sharp and unyielding, framing a face etched by time and a quiet, unrelenting discipline. His hair, a sharp salt and pepper undercut, caught the pale morning sun, giving him an air of austere intellect. Despite the biting cold that hovered just below freezing, he wore an olive-drab combat shirt. The high-performance fabric hugged his torso, while the heavy-duty camouflage sleeves accommodated his broad shoulders, accented by distinct tactical horizontal stripes across his biceps. Over the shirt, an unbuttoned, heavy coyote brown chore coat lined with thick fleece offered practical warmth. A brass carpenter's pencil rested comfortably behind his ear, a testament to his current, quieter life as a master woodworker. Beside him sat Valor. The 8-year-old German shepherd was an imposing figure, his thick black and tan coat absorbing the sunlight like velvet. Yet, time had touched Valor just as it had touched his master. A dusting of distinguished silver framed the dog's dark muzzle and deep, intelligent eyes. A distinct V-shaped notch on his left ear told a silent story of a past life long left behind in the dust and chaos of overseas deployments. Elias looked down, a rare, soft warmth thawing his steel-gray eyes. Valor wasn't wearing a tactical vest or heavy, intimidating working gear. Instead, a thick, simple leather collar with an oxidized brass tag rested comfortably around his neck. On his large paws were 4 olive-green winter booties. It was a tedious process every morning, coaxing the massive dog to sit while Elias strapped on the protective fabric. But he never skipped it. It was a quiet ritual of devotion, a necessity to protect Valor's paw pads from the stinging frost and the harsh, corrosive de-icing chemicals scattered across the town's pavements. A sudden, sharp metallic clang echoed across the plaza. A scaffolding worker had accidentally dropped a heavy steel pipe onto the frozen cobblestones. Elias's body reacted before his conscious, rational mind could intervene. His breath hitched, trapping the freezing air in his lungs. The thick muscles in his neck went rigid, and his left hand, marked by a long, pale scar running horizontally across the knuckles from a wire-cutting accident years ago, began to tremble uncontrollably. It was a phantom echo, the residual shrapnel of his years as a combat engineer in the Army. The noise wasn't just a dropped pipe. For a terrifying microsecond, his amygdala registered the sharp, fatal click of a pressure plate. The vibrant festival faded, replaced by the suffocating, dusty heat of a memory he couldn't quite bury. Valor moved instantly. The shepherd didn't bark, whine, or panic. Instead, he stepped close, leaning his heavy, solid weight firmly against Elias's thigh. Valor pushed his graying head upward, wedging it forcefully under Elias's trembling, scarred hand, applying a steady, unyielding pressure. Deep pressure therapy. It was a silent, meticulously practiced language between them. Elias closed his eyes tight, inhaling the grounding scent of the cold mountain air and the familiar musk of the dog's fur. He focused entirely on the physical weight against his leg, letting the steady, rhythmic thumping of Valor's heartbeat synchronize with his own frantic, racing pulse. 1, 2, 3. Slowly, the suffocating ghost town dissolved, and the glittering square of Silver Creek came back into focus. The snow was just snow. The pipe was just a pipe. "Good boy," Elias murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the festival noise. He gently scratched the spot behind the shepherd's intact ear. "I'm all right, buddy. Just a ghost passing through." Across the sprawling, sun-drenched square, standing on the elevated patio of an upscale boutique, the atmosphere was entirely different. Officer Marcus Vance of the Silver Creek Police Department adjusted his thick leather utility belt, ensuring his silver badge was perfectly angled to catch the morning light. At 35, Vance was a man entirely fueled by optics, ego, and an aggressive climbing ambition. His navy blue uniform was tailored to a fault, every crease ironed sharp enough to cut paper, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He didn't view the local townspeople as citizens he was sworn to protect. He viewed them as either stepping stones or irritating obstacles on his path to a command promotion. Standing elegantly beside him was Chloe. At 30, she was a walking, breathing manifestation of corporate acquisition. Dressed in a pristine white cashmere coat that practically repelled the dirt of the physical world, Chloe was the senior point woman for a luxury real estate conglomerate, quietly eyeing the historical downtown block. Her eyes, entirely shielded by oversized, geometric designer sunglasses, didn't see the rustic charm of the mom-and-pop bakeries or the generations of history in the brickwork. They saw square footage, profit margins, and the limitless potential of aggressive gentrification. "The mayor personally assured my board that this year's festival would showcase the upscale potential of Silver Creek," Chloe said. Her tone carried the precise manufactured chill of a corporate boardroom, entirely devoid of genuine warmth. She gestured vaguely with a gloved, manicured hand toward the plaza. "My investors are looking for a highly curated experience, Marcus. A premium, exclusive alpine destination. We want to attract hedge fund managers and tech CEOs, not the current demographic." Vance nodded enthusiastically, eager to align himself with the kind of boundless wealth and influence Chloe represented. "Absolutely, Chloe. I couldn't agree more. The department has been working overtime, pulling double shifts to ensure the perimeter is secure and the town's aesthetic remains uncompromised. We have a zero-tolerance policy for vagrancy or public disturbances this week." Chloe sighed, a delicate theatrical sound of manufactured disappointment. She pointed her finger across the square, straight toward the rustic wooden bench outside the local bakery. "Then what, pray tell, is that?" Vance followed her gaze. His eyes narrowed, focusing sharply on Elias Thorne. To the rest of the town, Elias was a respected master woodworker, a quiet, dignified presence who fixed broken porches for the elderly at cost and crafted beautiful, enduring custom furniture. But to Vance, whose perspective was entirely calibrated by Chloe's elitist lens, Elias was an unacceptable anomaly. A middle-aged man in faded charcoal cargo pants and a military-style combat shirt, sitting silently with a massive, wolf-like dog wearing green booties. He didn't look like a high-net-worth tourist. He looked like an unpolished, gritty remnant of the working-class town they were desperately trying to overwrite. "It ruins the entire visual symmetry of the promenade," Chloe continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper. "We are selling luxury and safety, Marcus, not whatever gritty lumberjack fantasy that man is trying to project. And a beast that size? It's highly intimidating. It makes the affluent families feel unsafe. My clients won't invest $40 million into this plaza if they feel they have to share the sidewalks with drifters and their guard dogs." Elias was neither a drifter nor a threat, and Valor was a highly trained, registered service animal, but objective facts were entirely irrelevant to Vance in the face of optics and opportunity. Vance felt a familiar, intoxicating surge of opportunistic authority. This was exactly the kind of minor, highly visible problem he could solve to prove his worth to the people writing the big checks. It was a chance to demonstrate his proactive policing. "You are completely right to be concerned," Vance said, his voice dropping into a register of practiced, authoritative concern designed to soothe the wealthy. "Town ordinances are very clear about maintaining a safe and orderly environment during major public events. Large, unrestrained animals pose a significant public liability." "He is holding a leash, Marcus," Chloe pointed out dryly, noticing the thick leather lead resting loosely in the older man's scarred hand. "A mere technicality," Vance countered, a slick, predatory smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Public safety is entirely about perception. If the animal looks threatening, it disrupts the peace. And frankly, the owner looks like he's looking for a confrontation. I've seen his type 100 times. Veterans who can't let go of the past, they always think the rules of polite society don't apply to them." Vance adjusted his radio earpiece, puffing out his chest beneath his pristine, heavily starched uniform. He was already drafting the incident report in his head. It would be a textbook removal, a firm, uncompromising display of a zero-tolerance policy. He would approach the arrogant old man, cite a vague municipal code regarding festival zoning regulations, and compel him to leave the commercial premises. If the man resisted, which, in Vance's arrogant and limited estimation, these stubborn, working-class types always did, it would only justify a more forceful, decisive intervention. And he would do it right in front of Chloe and her invisible, wealthy investors. Across the icy cobblestones, entirely oblivious to the hostile crosshairs, settling firmly on his back, Elias took a slow, savoring sip of his bitter black coffee. The gentle winter sun warmed his weathered face. Valor sat patiently by his side, his breath pluming like white smoke in the freezing air, his deep, empathetic eyes scanning the square. The morning was still crystal clear. The snow was still impossibly, blindingly white. But as Officer Marcus Vance placed his hand casually over his utility belt and began his deliberate, predatory march across the plaza, the pristine silence of Silver Creek was already beginning to fracture. The chessboard was set, and the opening move had been decided. Vance truly believed he was walking toward an easy target, a powerless remnant of a forgotten era he could simply sweep away to polish his own boots. He had absolutely no idea that he was about to step directly onto a minefield, meticulously wired by a master engineer. The morning's crystalline perfection shattered, not with a sudden explosion, but with the subtle, synthetic double beep of an Axon body camera powering on. Elias Thorne was sitting on a wrought iron bench beneath the emerald green awning of Martha's Hearth, the oldest bakery in Silver Creek. The air around him smelled of cinnamon, yeast, and melting frost. He had just finished his coffee, savoring the quiet hum of the community waking up. At his feet, Valor rested his heavy head on his front paws, his olive-green booties vivid against the dusting of fresh snow on the pavement. The old German shepherd was the picture of tranquility, his eyes half closed as he soaked in the pale winter sunlight. Then came the crunch of heavy, polished boots. Officer Marcus Vance stepped into Elias's peripheral vision, his posture rigid, his hand resting with deliberate casualness on his utility belt. A few paces behind him, picking her way through the snow in pristine suede boots, was Chloe. Elias's internal radar, honed by years in hostile environments, immediately flagged the approach. The spacing between the two, the forced casualness, the way Vance's eyes darted toward his chest-mounted camera to ensure the recording light was blinking red. It was a tactical setup. Elias didn't move. He simply shifted his weight, allowing his right hand to drop naturally closer to Valor's leather collar. As Chloe drew level with the bakery, she suddenly veered closer to the bench than necessary, violating the unspoken spatial etiquette of the wide sidewalk. Valor, sensing a shift in the environment, simply lifted his head, his ears perking up in mild curiosity. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He merely looked at the woman in the white cashmere coat. "Oh my God!" Chloe shrieked, a theatrical piercing sound that cut through the morning air like a siren. She stumbled backward, clutching her designer handbag to her chest as if using it as a shield. "Keep that beast away from me." It lunged. It tried to bite me. The performance was so profoundly manufactured that under different circumstances, Elias might have laughed, but the cold, predatory glint in Officer Vance's eyes suffocated any trace of humor. "Ma'am, step back. I've got this," Vance barked, injecting his voice with a manufactured heroism designed entirely for the body camera's microphone. He stepped between Chloe and the bench, his hand unsnapping the retention strap of his holster and coming to rest on the bright yellow handle of his X-26 taser. "Sir, stand up and step away from the animal now." Elias remained seated. His face, an unreadable mask of weathered stone, betrayed nothing. "Officer," Elias said, his voice a low, steady baritone that refused to compete with Vance's manufactured volume. "My dog is lying down. He hasn't made a sound, let alone lunged at anyone. You and I both know that." "I just witnessed an aggressive animal threaten a pedestrian," Vance retorted, leaning in. The polished silver of his badge caught the sunlight, a stark contrast to the ugliness of his intent. Under Municipal Code 14B regarding festival zoning, unmuzzled animals displaying aggressive behavior in high-traffic commercial sectors are subject to immediate impoundment. Inside the bakery, the bell above the door jingled frantically. Martha, a woman in her 60s wearing a flour-dusted apron, hurried out. "Marcus Vance, what on earth are you doing?" she demanded, wiping her hands on a towel. "Elias has been sitting here for an hour. That dog is practically asleep." "Stay back, Martha. This is an active police intervention," Vance snapped without looking at her. He keyed the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch, Unit 3. I need animal control at my location. Aggressive canine, owner is being uncooperative. Copy, Unit 3. Animal control is en route." Elias looked at Chloe, who was standing at a safe distance, a small, smug smile playing on her lips, before she quickly arranged her features into a mask of faux trauma for the camera. Then, Elias looked back at Vance. The young officer's stance was aggressive, bladed toward Elias, his hand gripping the taser so tightly his knuckles were white. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. He didn't just want the dog. He wanted Elias to give him an excuse. He wanted the working-class veteran to lose his temper, to shout, to shove him. The engineer in Elias analyzed the structural dynamics of the trap he was sitting in. It was a flawless, if morally bankrupt, design. If Elias argued, he was resisting. If he reached for his phone to record, Vance would claim he feared for his safety and deploy the taser. If Elias used even a fraction of the close-quarters combat training, hardwired into his muscles to protect his dog, he would be charged with assaulting a police officer. The calculus was brutally simple, and the math was devastating. An assault charge meant a felony. A felony meant jail time, and if the owner went to jail, the aggressive dog involved in the incident wouldn't be sent to a shelter. Valor would be labeled a public threat and euthanized by the end of the week. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over Elias. The ghost of his PTSD, triggered by the helplessness of the situation, clawed at the edges of his vision, threatening to drag him back to a sandy, blood-soaked road in a desert thousands of miles away. But he couldn't afford to break. Not here, not now. Valor, sensing the massive spike in his handler's internal distress, whined softly. The old dog stood up, ignoring Vance entirely, and pressed his heavy, warm flank firmly against Elias's leg. "Don't let him move," Vance shouted, drawing the taser and pointing it directly at Elias's chest. The twin red laser sights danced erratically across the olive-drab fabric of Elias's combat shirt. "Control the animal, or I will deploy." "Lower the weapon, officer," Elias said. The calmness in his voice was terrifying, an icy abyss that momentarily unsettled Vance. "I am complying. Do not escalate." A white municipal truck with green lettering pulled up to the curb, its amber lights flashing against the snow. An older man in a heavy parka stepped out, holding a catchpole. He took one look at the scene. The trembling woman, the aggressive cop with a drawn weapon, and the stoic man gently stroking a perfectly calm German shepherd, and frowned in obvious confusion. "Officer Vance?" the animal control worker asked hesitantly. "Dispatch," said aggressive. The animal attempted to bite a pedestrian, Miller, Vance ordered, keeping the taser aimed at Elias. "Impound it for a rabies quarantine and behavioral evaluation. Standard 5-day hold." Miller hesitated, looking at Valor, whose tail gave a small, slow wag at the newcomer. "Marcus, that dog is wearing booties. He doesn't look. Do your job, Miller, or I'll have you written up for obstructing a police investigation." Vance roared. Elias closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The structural load had reached its absolute limit. Something had to give, and he had to ensure it wasn't his freedom or Valor's life. He inhaled a sharp breath of freezing air, anchoring himself to the present. He slowly lowered himself to one knee, keeping his hands entirely visible. The cold seeped through the fabric of his cargo pants. He looked directly into Valor's deep, brown eyes. The dog tilted his head, his ears swiveling, confused by the strange tension, but entirely trusting of the man in front of him. Elias brought his scarred hand up and cupped the side of Valor's graying muzzle. He pressed his forehead against the dog's warm brow. For a moment, the bustling town, the arrogant cop, the smug corporate assistant, and the flashing amber lights ceased to exist. There was only the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing. "It's okay, old man," Elias whispered, his voice cracking just a fraction, a sound meant only for Valor. "You hold the line. I'll come for you, I promise." Elias unclipped the heavy brass clasp of the leather leash. He stood up slowly, facing the animal control officer. "He doesn't need the pole," Elias said to Miller, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Just open the cage." Miller, looking vaguely ashamed of his role in the theater, walked to the back of the truck and unlatched one of the metal doors. Elias didn't look at Vance. He didn't look at Chloe. He kept his eyes fixed on the metal box. He pointed a steady, scarred finger toward the open door. "Valor. Hup!" The old German shepherd looked at Elias, then at the truck. Training overrode instinct. With a quiet, resigned obedience that shattered the hearts of the few bystanders who had gathered, Valor trotted over to the truck. The green booties padded softly against the snow. He hopped up onto the metal bumper and stepped into the small, dark cage. Miller closed the door. The metallic clang of the latch dropping into place sounded like a gunshot in the crisp morning air. "Smart choice," Vance sneered. Holstering his taser, he adjusted his collar, looking incredibly pleased with himself. "You can check the impound lot after the festival, assuming it passes the behavioral evaluation, of course." Elias didn't reply. He didn't blink. He simply stood there, a solitary pillar of stone beneath the bakery awning. The animal control truck pulled away from the curb, its tires crunching through the fresh snow. Elias watched it until it turned the corner and disappeared behind a row of frosted pine trees. The silence in the timber-framed cabin was not merely the absence of noise. It possessed a crushing, physical weight. For the past 3 years, Elias's home had been defined by a constant, comforting rhythm. The heavy, rhythmic thud of a tail against the cedar floorboards, the soft click of claws following him from the kitchen to the workshop, the deep, rumbling sighs of a large animal dreaming by the hearth. Now, the air in the small living room was perfectly still, stagnant and suffocating. Elias stood by the front door. He meticulously draped the thick leather leash over its designated brass hook, taking entirely too long to ensure it hung perfectly straight. He didn't pace. He didn't smash a fist into the drywall or reach for the bottle of bourbon gathering dust in the top cabinet. Such chaotic releases of emotion were a luxury a combat engineer could not afford. Panic and rage were the enemies of structure. They compromised the foundation, and right now, Elias needed his foundation to be absolute. Yet, as he walked to the kitchen counter to pour a glass of water, his scarred left hand automatically dropped to his side, his fingers curling slightly in anticipation of burying themselves in thick, coarse fur. They met empty air. Elias froze. The phantom sensation was a sharp, localized agony, far worse than any physical wound he had ever sustained. He closed his eyes, took a measured breath, and let the engineer's mind take over. Valor was not dead. He was impounded. An impoundment was a bureaucratic process, and every process had rules, timelines, and paperwork. It was a machine. And if there was one thing Elias Thorne understood intimately, it was how to dismantle a machine. 30 minutes later, Elias walked through the heavy glass doors of the Silver Creek Municipal Building. The contrast to the vibrant, fairy light-draped festival outside was jarring. The town hall was a monument to sterile, fluorescent-lit apathy. Beige walls, gray linoleum floors, and the dull, endless hum of the HVAC system created an atmosphere designed to grind down hope and mandate compliance. Elias pulled a paper ticket from the dispenser and sat on a hard plastic chair, his posture impeccably straight. When his number was finally called, he approached the thick plexiglass window of the Department of Animal Control and Licensing. "I need the impound records for a German Shepherd brought in this morning," Elias said to the young, thoroughly disinterested clerk scrolling through her phone. "Owner name is Elias Thorne. The dog is a registered service animal." The clerk sighed, slowly typing the name into her keyboard. A moment later, her chewing gum snapped. "Okay, yeah. Code 14B violation. Aggressive behavior in a commercial zone. The animal is being held at the county facility. I would like to pay the fine and arrange for his immediate release." "Can't do that, sir," she replied, not looking up from the monitor. "Officer Vance filed this under a dangerous animal statute. It requires a mandatory quarantine and a magistrate's hearing to determine the animal's disposition." Elias's eyes narrowed slightly. "When is the hearing?" "Magistrate is out of town for the Ice and Snow Festival. Won't be back on the bench until next Wednesday. 5 days. They were going to keep an 8-year-old service dog locked in a freezing concrete run surrounded by strange barking animals for 5 days. For a dog like Valor, whose entire existence was predicated on staying close to his handler, the isolation would be psychological torture. Well, look who decided to visit the principal's office. Elias didn't turn around immediately. He recognized the slick, arrogant tenor of Officer Marcus Vance's voice. Vance strolled into the lobby holding a foam cup of coffee, his pristine uniform standing out starkly against the drab administrative background. He stepped right up to Elias, invading his personal space with the casual entitlement of a man who believed the badge made him untouchable. "You're wasting your time, Thorne," Vance said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the lobby security guard and a few waiting citizens to hear. "The dog is a public menace. The paperwork is filed, the quarantine is locked, and the town attorney fully supports the seizure. Unless you can afford a $5,000 retainer by this afternoon to file an emergency injunction, that animal is staying right where it is." Vance took a sip of his coffee, a predatory smirk dancing on his lips. He was waiting for the explosion. He wanted Elias to yell, to threaten him, to cause a scene in the lobby so he could arrest him for disorderly conduct. Elias looked at Vance. He didn't see a formidable adversary. He saw a structural flaw. He saw a man whose arrogance had vastly outpaced his intelligence. "I am officially requesting a copy of the incident report, the witness statement, and the impoundment manifest, officer," Elias said, his tone entirely devoid of the anger Vance was desperate to provoke. It was calm, flat, and chillingly polite. "Under the state's sunshine laws, those are matters of public record. I will wait." Vance's smirk faltered slightly, disappointed by the lack of fireworks. He scoffed, shaking his head. "Print the old man his papers, Cindy. Let him read how legally screwed he is." Vance turned and walked down the hallway, tossing a final barb over his shoulder. "Enjoy the festival, Thorne. Heard it's going to be a cold one." Behind the glass, at a desk situated a few feet away from the front counter, Sarah listened to the entire exchange. Sarah was 45, an administrative archivist who had worked in the municipal building for over a decade. Dressed in a practical maroon cardigan and a modest floral blouse, she was the kind of woman most people looked right past, which made her the most observant person in the building. She had tired, kind eyes and a profound, quiet exhaustion that came from years of watching small-town corruption operate under the guise of municipal zoning. She knew exactly what Marcus Vance was. She had processed the paperwork when he had impounded the taco truck of a local vendor just before the summer parade, claiming permit irregularities, effectively bankrupting the man to make room for a corporate sponsor's booth. But this was different. Sarah remembered Elias Thorne. 2 years ago, after her husband passed away from cancer, her front porch steps had begun to rot, dangerously close to collapsing. She couldn't afford a contractor. Elias had shown up one Saturday morning with a truck full of lumber. He hadn't asked for payment. He simply said her husband had once helped him jump-start a truck in a blizzard, and sitting quietly in the grass the entire afternoon, never barking, never wandering, was that beautiful, gentle German shepherd. Sarah looked at Elias now, standing stoically at the window. He was completely alone, facing a bureaucratic machine designed specifically to crush people like him. Yet, he wasn't begging. He wasn't screaming. He was simply holding the line, maintaining his dignity in a room designed to strip it away. Cindy, the front desk clerk, haphazardly printed a few pages, stapled them together, and shoved them through the slot under the plexiglass. "Here. Next." Elias took the papers. He didn't storm out. He stood to the side, pulling his brass carpenter's pencil from behind his ear, and began reading the document line by line, annotating the margins. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. If she intervened, she risked her pension. She risked the steady paycheck that kept her afloat in an increasingly expensive tourist town. But watching this quiet, honorable man being systematically broken by a bully wearing a badge twisted something deep inside her conscience. The safety of her silence had suddenly become too toxic to swallow. She stood up, grabbing a stack of blank file folders to make herself look busy, and walked out from behind the secure administrative partition into the main lobby. She approached the bulletin board next to where Elias was standing, pretending to arrange a few community flyers. "Mr. Thorne," Sarah murmured. Her voice was barely a breath, her eyes fixed entirely on a flyer for a winter bake sale. Elias didn't look up from his papers, but his posture shifted slightly, signaling he was listening. "The incident report Vance filed is legally airtight," Sarah whispered rapidly, her hands trembling slightly as she pinned a paper to the corkboard. "He categorized it under a specific emergency ordinance. The front desk can't help you. The magistrate won't help you. Then I need to find the friction point," Elias replied softly, turning a page. "Vance has done this before." Sarah breathed, glancing nervously down the hall toward the police liaison office. "This isn't an isolated incident. There is a pattern. But the records that prove it aren't available at the front desk. They are archived in the secondary database. I have the access codes." Elias finally stopped reading. The tip of his brass pencil hovered over the paper. He didn't look at her, knowing any sudden interaction might draw the security guard's attention. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your dog is innocent," Sarah said, a fierce, unexpected conviction laced through her quiet voice. "And because I am sick of watching that man treat this town like his personal chessboard." She took a small yellow sticky note from her pocket and slipped it smoothly under the edge of Elias's printed incident report. "The diner on 4th Street closed an hour ago, but the owner leaves the back booth unlocked for the cleaning crew," Sarah whispered, picking up her empty folders. "Be there at 7 tonight. Use the alley entrance. And Mr. Thorne? Elias gave a microscopic nod. Bring a secure hard drive. Sarah turned and walked briskly back behind the secure partition, her sensible shoes clicking quietly against the linoleum. Elias slowly folded the incident report, sliding it into the deep pocket of his chore coat along with the yellow sticky note. As he walked out of the town hall and back into the freezing, sunlit streets of Silver Creek, the crushing weight in his chest hadn't entirely vanished, but a new, highly focused energy had taken its place. The engineer finally had the blueprint. Now, it was time to tear the building down. The afternoon sun was already sinking behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies, casting long, frigid shadows across the cobblestones of Silver Creek. Elias Thorne did not return to his empty cabin. A structural failure required immediate surveying, and the first step was gathering raw data. He walked 2 blocks down from Martha's hearth, away from the glittering festival preparations, and pushed open the heavy glass door of Pioneer Hardware. The air inside was thick with the comforting, utilitarian scents of machine oil, fertilizer, and cut pine. It was a stark contrast to the sterile anxiety of the town hall. Behind the counter stood Arthur Henderson. At 72, Arthur was as much a fixture of the town as the mountains themselves. He wore faded denim overalls and a thick flannel shirt, his knuckles permanently stained with grease. Last winter, when a heavy snowstorm had collapsed the rear roof of Arthur's storage shed, Elias had spent 3 days reinforcing the trusses in sub-zero temperatures, charging the old man only for the cost of the raw timber. In towns like Silver Creek, that kind of quiet currency carried far more weight than cash. Elias, Arthur greeted, his bushy white eyebrows drawing together in a scowl of genuine concern. Martha called me, told me what Marcus Vance pulled this morning. It's a damn outrage. That dog of yours has gentler manners than most of the tourists. It was a setup, Arthur, Elias said, his voice level. He stepped up to the counter, pulling his hands from his chore coat pockets. Vance claimed Valor lunged at a woman. I need to prove he didn't. Arthur didn't ask questions. He didn't offer hollow sympathies. He simply nodded and gestured for Elias to follow him into the cramped, cluttered back office. I installed a new high-def security camera last month, Arthur muttered, clicking a mouse on a dusty desktop monitor. Too many out-of-toners trying to walk off with my premium snow shovels. It points right across the plaza. Catches the front of Martha's awning perfectly. Arthur rewound the footage to the timestamp Elias provided. On the screen, the scene played out in silent, indisputable clarity. There was Elias, drinking his coffee. There was Valor, lying perfectly still, a dark shape against the snow. Then, Vance and the woman in the white coat entered the frame. The high-definition lens captured the exact moment. Chloe abruptly veered off her path, stepping aggressively into Valor's space. The camera showed Valor merely lifting his head. No bared teeth, no lunge, just a sleepy, confused pivot of his ears. Then, Chloe threw herself backward in a cartoonish display of manufactured panic. Son of a bitch, Arthur growled, his jaw tightening. She practically threw herself at the poor animal. Can you export that to a drive? Elias asked, his eyes locked on the screen. I'll give you the original file, the backups, and an affidavit stating it hasn't been tampered with, Arthur said fiercely, plugging a silver thumb drive into the tower. Vance has been treating this town like a military occupation for 2 years. It's about time somebody held his feet to the fire. By 6:45 p.m., the temperature had plummeted to a bitter chill. Elias stood in the narrow, unlit alleyway behind Rusty's Diner, a greasy spoon that had closed its doors hours ago. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint, yellow glow of a distant street lamp reflecting off the ice. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy steel service door creaked open. Sarah stepped out into the freezing air. She had traded her sensible cardigan for a heavy, dark puffer coat, her breath pluming in rapid, nervous clouds. She looked up and down the alley, her eyes wide with the raw adrenaline of a woman who had never broken a rule in her life, let alone committed municipal whistleblowing. Elias stepped out of the shadows, ensuring his hands were visible and his movements slow so as not to startle her. Mr. Thorne, she breathed, rushing forward. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted solid-state drive, pressing it into his scarred palm. Her fingers were ice-cold and trembling. "I have it," Elias said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the dark alley. "Thank you, Sarah. You didn't have to take this risk." "Yes, I did," she replied, her voice gaining a sudden fierce traction. "My husband loved this town. He loved the people in it. I've spent 2 years watching Marcus Vance systematically tear it apart, piece by piece, and I just kept filing the paperwork." She pointed a gloved finger at the drive in his hand. "I miscategorized those files before I downloaded them so they won't trigger an IT audit for at least 48 hours. Look at the Class C municipal citations from the last 18 months. Specifically, look at the addresses. What am I looking for?" "A pattern," Sarah whispered, pulling her hood up. "Vance isn't just a bully, Mr. Thorne. He's a broom. Good luck." Before Elias could say another word, she slipped back through the heavy steel door, the latch clicking shut with finality. By 10 p.m., the interior of Elias's cabin had been transformed into a war room. He hadn't turned on the television or the radio. The only sound was the crackle of the wood stove and the soft, rhythmic tapping of his brass carpenter's pencil against the heavy oak dining table. Elias did not possess the rapid-fire hacking skills of a cybersecurity expert. He was an engineer. He understood the world through load paths, stress points, and blueprints. He had printed out hundreds of pages from Sarah's drive and Arthur's video stills, pinning them to a large corkboard he usually used for drafting furniture designs, connecting the data points with a thick red marker. He approached the spreadsheet logically, organizing Vance's enforcement records chronologically. Sarah was right. The sheer volume of Class C citations, minor subjective infractions like NODS violations, improper waste disposal, and public nuisance was staggering. But it was when Elias began cross-referencing the addresses of the citations with property transfer records that the true architecture of the corruption revealed itself. He traced a thick red line from a citation issued to a family-owned food truck for obstructing pedestrian flow. The fine was astronomical. 2 weeks later, the truck's permit was revoked. A month after that, the empty lot they used to rent was purchased by a holding company called Alpine Vista Holdings. He drew another line. A local mechanics shop, cited by Vance for a minor environmental hazard, a small oil spill on the sidewalk. The shop was forced to close for a lengthy, expensive inspection. Bankruptcy followed. The property was immediately snapped up by Summit Reach Enterprises. Elias cross-checked the corporate registries for both holding companies. They were shell corporations, and they all traced back to one parent conglomerate, the luxury real estate firm represented by the woman in the white cashmere coat, Chloe. The breath hitched in Elias's throat, not from panic, but from the chilling perfection of the design. Vance wasn't acting out of a twisted sense of law and order. He was acting as a weaponized enforcement arm for corporate gentrification. He used vague municipal codes to harass, bankrupt, and evict the working-class residents and small business owners occupying prime real estate. Once the businesses folded or the residents were forced to leave due to mounting fines, Chloe's firm swooped in, buying the devalued properties for pennies on the dollar to build their premium alpine destination. And this morning, Elias and his large, working-class dog had been sitting on a public bench right in the middle of the plaza they were trying to sanitize for their wealthy investors. Valor wasn't impounded because he was dangerous. He was impounded because he didn't fit the aesthetic, and Vance was eager to prove his utility to his corporate handlers. Elias stepped back from the corkboard. The chaotic scatter of paperwork had coalesced into a flawless, undeniable blueprint of systemic, predatory corruption. The foundation was rotten to its core. He looked at the empty space by the hearth where Valor should have been sleeping. The cold, mechanical anger that had been simmering in his chest all day finally crystallized into something sharp, precise, and devastating. Elias sat back down at his laptop. He didn't draft an angry letter to the mayor. He didn't write an appeal to the magistrate. He began compiling the video, the citations, and the property records into a single, high-definition, unassailable multimedia presentation. He was going to tear their pristine, curated world apart, and he was going to do it using their own bricks. The opening night of the Silver Creek Ice and Snow Festival was a masterpiece of manufactured winter magic. The town square had been transformed into a sprawling, glittering alpine wonderland. Fairy lights dripped from the frosted branches of the ancient pines, and portable fire pits cast a warm, flickering glow against the faces of the affluent crowd. At the northern edge of the plaza stood the festival's centerpiece, a massive wall of harvested lake ice, 50 feet across and 20 feet high. It had been shaved and polished by chainsaws and sanders until its surface was as smooth as glass, designed to serve as a colossal, translucent projection screen for the evening's keynote presentation. Officer Marcus Vance walked the perimeter of the VIP section, his chest puffed out beneath a heavy, tailored winter patrol jacket. He felt less like a public servant and more like a monarch surveying his newly conquered territory. He offered crisp salutes to the town council members and shared easy, conspiratorial smiles with the wealthy developers holding flutes of champagne. A few yards away, Chloe was holding court with a circle of hedge fund managers, her pristine white cashmere coat glowing under the halogen lights. The undesirables had been swept away. The square was sanitized, profitable, and entirely under Vance's control, or so he thought. Elias Thorne did not attempt to push through the throngs of tourists in the main plaza. A combat engineer knew better than to assault a fortified position from the front. Instead, he navigated the narrow, shadowed service alleys behind the pop-up artisan stalls, moving with the quiet, deliberate grace of a man who belonged to the night. He wore his heavy coyote brown chore coat, blending in perfectly with the frantic caterers and event staff rushing through the service corridors. He didn't need a map to find his target. He simply looked down at his boots. Thick, yellow, heavy-duty power cables snaked across the frozen ground, distributing electricity from the generators to the various festival arrays. Elias followed the thickest cluster of cables, tracing the central nervous system of the event directly to a heated, reinforced canvas tent set up on a raised platform behind the ice wall. Elias unzipped the flap and stepped inside. The AV control tent was a cramped, sweltering cocoon of humming electronics, glowing monitors, and tangled wires. The air smelled of hot dust and ozone from a rattling space heater. Sitting in a folding chair, hunched over a massive 32-channel digital mixing console, was Leo. At 24, Leo possessed the perpetual, caffeine-fueled exhaustion of a freelance live event technician. He wore an oversized black hoodie, a faded beanie pulled low over a mess of dark hair, and fingerless compression gloves to keep his hands warm while operating the tactile faders. When Elias stepped into the tent, letting a blast of freezing wind inside, Leo spun around, his expression instantly defensive. "Hey man, you can't be in here," Leo said, standing up and pointing toward the exit. "This is a restricted technical zone. VIPs and authorized staff only." Elias calmly zipped the tent flap shut behind him, sealing out the noise of the festival. He didn't move aggressively. He kept his hands visible, letting his eyes scan the impressive array of video switchers and media servers. "You're running a Barco E2 presentation system," Elias observed, his deep voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. "That's high-end gear for a municipal event. Must have cost a fortune to rent." Leo blinked, taken aback by the older man's immediate technical fluency. "I didn't rent it, I own it. Look, buddy, whoever you are, the mayor's speech starts in 5 minutes, and I have a cue sequence to lock in. I need you to leave." Elias stepped fully into the light of the monitors. "My name is Elias Thorne." Leo's defensive posture faltered. He looked at Elias's weathered face, the sharp jawline, and the distinct, horizontal scar across the knuckles of his left hand. The town's grapevine was incredibly efficient. "You're the guy with the German Shepherd," Leo said, his voice dropping. "The one Vance impounded this morning." "I am," Elias said flatly. He reached into the deep pocket of his chore coat and pulled out the encrypted solid-state drive Sarah had given him, onto which he had spent the afternoon loading his meticulously compiled presentation. He set the small, silver rectangle gently on the edge of the mixing console. Leo stared at the drive. "What is that?" "It's a structural analysis," Elias replied. He looked around the small tent, noting a heavy Pelican case shoved into the corner. A long strip of heavy-duty black gaffer tape covered a deep, unnatural gouge in the hard plastic. "I heard about what happened at the summer parade last year, Leo. I heard Officer Vance confiscated your main drone and your primary camera rig right before the fireworks." Leo's jaw tightened, a flash of old, unresolved anger tightening his youthful features. He claimed my flight path violated a sudden, unannounced municipal airspace restriction. It was garbage. He just wanted the airspace clear so the corporate media team hired by some real estate firm could get the exclusive aerial shots. By the time I paid the fines to get my gear out of the impound lot, the Pelican case was cracked and 2 lenses were ruined. The town rejected my damage claim. "Vance didn't just break your equipment," Elias said quietly. Leaning forward slightly, "He broke your leverage. He used the badge to steal your livelihood so someone else could profit." Elias tapped a scarred finger against the silver drive. "On this drive is a single, high-definition video file. It contains the security footage from Arthur Henderson's hardware store from this morning. It shows exactly what happened between my dog, Officer Vance, and the woman from the real estate conglomerate. Following that footage is a detailed documented schematic tracing 18 months of Vance's municipal citations directly to the shell companies buying up this town." Leo looked from the drive to Elias, his eyes wide. He understood immediately what the older man was asking him to do. "If I play that," Leo whispered, running a gloved hand nervously over his beanie, "they'll blacklist me. I'll never work a municipal contract in this county again. Vance will probably try to arrest me for hacking the mainframe or some other made-up charge." "I am not asking you to hack anything," Elias said, his tone entirely reasonable, grounding the young technician's panic. "You are the primary operator. The system is yours. You have total manual control over the input source. I am just a man who dropped a flash drive on your table." Elias stepped back toward the tent flap. "If you run the town's promotional video, the machine keeps working exactly as designed. Vance gets his promotion. The developers buy the plaza. My dog dies in a concrete run on Wednesday, but if you switch the input, you show this town exactly what kind of foundation they are standing on. The choice is yours, Leo. I won't force your hand." Elias turned around, unzipped the tent, and walked back out into the freezing night, leaving the young technician alone with the hum of the servers and the silver drive resting on the console. Out in the plaza, the orchestral music swelled to a triumphant crescendo. Standing on a raised dais in front of the massive ice wall, the mayor tapped the microphone. The feedback echoed across the square, bringing the murmuring crowd of investors, tourists, and locals to a halt. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor boomed, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Welcome to the Silver Creek Ice and Snow Festival. Tonight, we don't just celebrate our history, we look forward to our future. A future of prosperity, elegance, and uncompromised beauty. To show you exactly what that future holds, please turn your attention to the ice wall." The mayor gestured grandly. Beside the stage, Chloe smiled brightly, raising her champagne flute. Officer Vance stood at attention, ready to bask in the glow of the corporate utopia he had helped secure. The orchestral music faded out. The staging lights illuminating the plaza abruptly snapped off, plunging the crowd into sudden, dramatic darkness. Inside the AV tent, Leo stared at the mixing console. His finger hovered over the primary media server button. He looked at the town's authorized flash drive, labeled SC Promo Phenol. Then, he looked at the deep, ugly gouge in his Pelican case. A slow, grim smile spread across Leo's face. With a definitive heavy click, he unplugged the town's drive, shoved Elias's silver drive into the master port, and violently slammed the input fader all the way to the top. Out in the square, a beam of light, boasting 30,000 lumens of blinding clarity, erupted from the projection tower. It hit the massive, polished surface of the 50-foot ice wall. But it wasn't a soaring drone shot of snow-capped peaks. It wasn't a rendering of luxury condominiums. The ice wall illuminated with the crisp, undeniable security footage from Pioneer hardware. 50 feet wide and crystal clear, the silent drama played out before the assembled elite. There was Elias, sitting peacefully. There was Valor, resting quietly. And there, magnified to the size of a building, was Chloe, aggressively stepping into the dog's space before throwing herself backward in a pantomime of absolute fiction. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the plaza. Down by the stage, Chloe's champagne flute slipped from her manicured fingers, shattering against the cobblestones. The smile was entirely wiped from her face, replaced by a mask of bloodless, absolute horror. Before the crowd could process the blatant perjury, the video cut. The ice wall was instantly covered in a stark, beautifully designed infographic. It was a masterpiece of structural engineering applied to data. Thick red lines appeared on the ice, connecting the names of local businesses, the taco truck, the mechanic, the bakery, to the specific petty citations signed by Officer Marcus Vance. Then the lines converged. They flowed from Vance's badge number directly to the property acquisition records of Alpine Vista Holdings and Summit Reach Enterprises before finally culminating in the corporate logo of Chloe's real estate conglomerate. It was a perfectly drawn blueprint of corruption, undeniable and laid bare for the entire town to see. No one cheered, no one screamed. The music was gone. The chatter had vanished. The only sound in the heart of Silver Creek was the crackle of the fire pits and the low hum of the massive projector. The trap had not merely been sprung. It had been detonated with the silent, devastating precision of a master engineer. Marcus Vance looked up at the 50-foot projection of his own signature, authorizing the destruction of his neighbors' lives. The arrogant, untouchable king of the promenade was gone. In his place stood a pale, terrified man, utterly paralyzed by the crushing, suffocating silence of the truth. The silence that gripped the Silver Creek Plaza was not the peaceful quiet of a winter snowfall. It was the suffocating, highly pressurized vacuum that immediately follows a detonation. For 10 agonizing seconds, the 50-foot projection of the town's corruption burned brightly against the ice wall, reflecting off the retinas of every investor, tourist, and local citizen present. Then the silence finally fractured. It did not break into a riotous uproar, but into a low, venomous murmur that swept through the VIP section like a sudden frost. The hedge fund managers and luxury developers, people whose entire livelihoods depended on pristine public relations and risk avoidance, physically recoiled from Chloe. The proximity to blatant, documented fraud was a contagion they could not afford. "This is an absolute farce," a silver-haired investor muttered, setting his champagne flute down on a frozen cocktail table with a sharp clink. He didn't look at Chloe. He simply turned his back and began walking toward the exit. Within seconds, a mass exodus of the town's prospective financial saviors followed. Chloe's pristine white cashmere coat suddenly looked less like a symbol of elite status and more like a glowing target. Panic, raw and unmanicured, warped her meticulously contoured face. She fumbled for her dropped designer handbag, her high heels slipping precariously on the icy cobblestones as she tried to quietly weave her way out of the spotlight. She was abandoning the ship, and she was leaving Marcus Vance chained to the helm. Vance stood frozen near the stage, his mind short-circuiting. The immaculate, invincible reality he had constructed for himself was unraveling in real time. He looked at the ice wall, then at the retreating investors, and finally at the sea of disgusted faces in the crowd. His survival instinct, entirely divorced from logic or law, kicked in. He needed a scapegoat. He needed to reassert his authority through the only language he truly understood: force. His eyes darted past the ice wall, scanning the shadowed perimeter. There, stepping calmly out from the canvas flap of the AV control tent, was Elias Thorne. "You," Vance roared, his voice cracking with a desperate, hysterical edge that shattered any remaining illusion of his professional composure. He unclipped his radio, tossing it aside, and drew a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Vance charged across the snow-dusted plaza, his polished boots slipping clumsily. Elias Thorne, you are under arrest. Cyber-terrorism, tampering with municipal infrastructure, and resisting an officer. Elias did not run. He did not brace for a fight. He simply stood at the edge of the shadows, the lapels of his coyote-brown chore coat rustling slightly in the biting wind. He watched Vance's frantic approach with the same clinical, detached observation of an engineer watching a condemned building finally collapse under its own structural failures. Get on the ground, face down in the snow, right now! Vance screamed, closing the distance to 20 yards, brandishing the handcuffs like a weapon. But Vance never reached him. From the edges of the artisan stalls, a figure stepped into the path of the charging officer. It was Arthur Henderson. The 72-year-old hardware store owner planted his work boots firmly into the snow, crossing his thick flannel-clad arms over his chest. Arthur, step aside. That is a lawful order, Vance barked, though he instinctively slowed down, confused by the sudden obstacle. There's nothing lawful about you, Marcus, Arthur said, his voice carrying the gritty, immovable weight of the mountains. Before Vance could attempt to physically move the older man, another figure stepped up beside Arthur. It was Martha, still wearing her flour-dusted apron, her face set in a mask of fierce maternal defiance. Then came the owner of the local mechanic shop. Then the barista from the corner cafe. One by one, the working-class citizens of Silver Creek, the people who had swept the sidewalks, fixed the roofs, and kept the town breathing while men like Vance tried to sell its soul, stepped out of the crowd. They did not shout. They did not raise their fists. They simply linked arms and stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable living wall of denim, canvas, and absolute resolve between the corrupt officer and the veteran who had fought for them. Vance skidded to a halt just 3 feet from the human barricade. He raised his handcuffs, his hands shaking violently. This is obstruction of justice. I will arrest every single one of you. I'll call in the county sheriff. Call them, Arthur challenged softly. Let's show them the video on the ice. Behind the wall of citizens, Elias felt a strange, unfamiliar tightness in his chest. For years, his survival had depended entirely on his own hypervigilance, his own ability to hold the line in absolute isolation. He had built his defenses high and thick to keep the world out. Yet, looking at the backs of these people, bakers, mechanics, retirees, who were willingly risking their own safety to shield him, a profound realization settled over his scarred soul. He wasn't alone. The foundation of this community wasn't broken. It had just been buried. Up on the stage, Mayor Harrison was drowning in a cold sweat. He watched his multi-million-dollar revitalization project evaporate into the winter night. He looked at the angry, unified mob of voters blocking his chief enforcement officer. The political calculus was instantaneous and brutal. If he backed Vance now, the town would riot, the state would intervene, and his career would end in a federal indictment. The mayor grabbed the microphone, his knuckles turning white. "Officer Vance, stand down immediately." The mayor's amplified voice echoed off the historic brick facades, freezing Vance in his tracks. The officer turned his head, looking up at the stage with wide, betrayed eyes. "Mr. Mayor, these people are—" "I said, stand down," the mayor shouted, his voice trembling with forced authority. He pointed a trembling finger at the disgraced officer. "You have disgraced this uniform in this town. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay. You will surrender your badge and your firearm to the watch commander tonight. The State Department of Internal Affairs will be taking over this precinct by morning." The handcuffs slipped from Vance's trembling fingers, landing in the snow with a dull, pathetic thud. The fight drained out of him instantly, leaving only a hollow, terrified shell. He was no longer the king of the promenade. He was just an unemployed man facing a lengthy prison sentence for perjury and extortion. As Vance stood paralyzed by his sudden, catastrophic downfall, another man stepped onto the stage, gently taking the microphone from the mayor's sweating hands. Dr. Harrison Gable was a man in his mid-50s, dressed in a thick tweed coat and wire-rimmed glasses. As the director of the County Animal Control Services, he had been invited to the festival as a courtesy VIP guest. For the last 10 minutes, he had watched the ice wall with growing, profound disgust. His department was designed to protect animals and citizens, not to be utilized as a weaponized towing service for corrupt cops. "Mr. Thorne," Dr. Gable's calm, authoritative voice echoed across the square. The crowd of citizens gently parted, allowing Elias to step forward into the light. He looked up at the stage. As the director of the agency that holds jurisdiction over impoundments, Dr. Gable continued, adjusting his glasses, "I have just witnessed undeniable video evidence of perjury by the arresting officer. A seizure based on a fraudulent sworn statement is legally void. There will be no 5-day hold. There will be no magistrate's hearing." Dr. Gable pulled a heavy Motorola radio from his belt. "Unit 4, this is Director Gable. The impoundment of the German Shepherd under Vance's order is officially nullified. Open the primary transport bay immediately." At the far southern edge of the plaza, parked near the barricades, the white municipal truck's amber lights were still slowly spinning. The animal control officer, Miller, who had been listening to the entire plaza broadcast, didn't hesitate. He practically jogged to the back of the truck and through the heavy metal latch. The cage door swung open. For a single heartbeat, the plaza was entirely still. Then, a massive shape launched itself from the back of the truck. The olive-green booties hit the snow-covered cobblestones with rapid, muffled thuds. Valor didn't look at the lights, the crowds, or the towering ice wall. His deep brown eyes were locked entirely on a single figure standing in the center of the square. "Valor!" Elias called out, his voice cracking, shedding the last remnants of his stoic armor. The German Shepherd sprinted across the plaza like a furry torpedo. Elias dropped to both knees in the snow, opening his arms. Valor slammed into his chest with enough force to knock a lesser man backward. The dog let out a high-pitched, ecstatic whine, a sound of pure joy that he had never permitted himself to make while on duty. Valor buried his graying muzzle deep into the crook of Elias's neck, his tail wagging with such ferocious speed his entire back half vibrated. Elias buried his face in the thick, coarse fur of his only friend. He didn't care about the snow soaking through his pants. He didn't care about the hundreds of eyes watching him. His scarred left hand gripped the thick leather collar, pulling the dog as close as physically possible. The crushing, suffocating weight that had paralyzed his chest all day instantly evaporated, replaced by a surge of overwhelming, breathtaking relief. Around them, the crowd didn't cheer with the chaotic, aggressive roar of a sports stadium. Instead, a wave of genuine, heartfelt applause rippled through the plaza. Arthur clapped Martha on the shoulder. Sarah, standing near the back of the crowd, wiped a quiet tear from her cheek. The Ice and Snow Festival had lost its corporate sponsors and its pristine manufactured image, but as Elias Thorne knelt in the snow, holding onto his dog under the warm glow of the fairy lights and the protective gaze of his neighbors, Silver Creek had finally found its soul again. 1 month later, Silver Creek had shed its manufactured winter skin. The colossal ice wall that had dominated the central plaza was long gone, melted down by a combination of unseasonably warm Chinook winds and the deliberate, mechanical clearing efforts of the town's public works department. The imported fairy lights and the corporate banners had been packed away into storage. In their absence, the town had returned to its natural, unpretentious state. The Victorian brick facades breathed easier without the suffocating drape of luxury branding, and the snow that blanketed the cobblestones was no longer a curated prop, but simply the quiet, beautiful reality of a Colorado winter. Inside his timber-framed cabin, Elias Thorne poured the last drop of dark roast coffee into his travel mug. The morning sun streamed through the large eastern window, catching the dancing dust motes in the air and warming the wide cedar floorboards. By the hearth, Valor let out a long, contented sigh. The old German Shepherd stretched his front legs, his tail giving a lazy, rhythmic thump, thump, thump against the braided rug. Elias knelt beside him, holding the familiar olive-green booties. "All right, old man, let's get these on," Elias murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble devoid of the tightly coiled tension that had defined it a month ago. Valor didn't just tolerate the process today. He actively participated, lifting his large paws one by one with practiced ease. Elias secured the Velcro straps, his scarred left hand moving steadily. There was no phantom trembling. The ghosts of the desert, the suffocating memories of pressure plates and shrapnel, hadn't completely vanished. Elias knew better than to expect a miraculous cure, but they had retreated to a quiet, manageable distance. They no longer sat on his chest. Stepping out onto the porch, Elias inhaled the crisp, pine-scented air. He wore his heavy coyote brown chore coat and his usual charcoal cargo pants, but the tactical combat shirt had been replaced by a simple, heavy-knit wool sweater. He didn't feel the need for armor today. The walk to the downtown plaza was a masterclass in structural tranquility. As Elias and Valor made their way down Main Street, the subtle shifts in the town's architecture were undeniable, not in the buildings themselves, but in the atmosphere. Elias stopped by the newsstand outside of Pioneer Hardware. Through the glass window, Arthur Henderson was busy stocking a display of rock salt. The older man looked up, wiping his grease-stained hands on his denim overalls, and offered a firm, respectful nod through the glass. Elias returned the gesture, a silent acknowledgement between two men who had held a difficult line together. Elias dropped 2 quarters into the metal box and pulled out a copy of the Silver Creek Chronicle. The headline dominating the front page was written in stark, unambiguous black ink. State Grand Jury Index Former, Officer Vance on perjury fraud charge. Elias scanned the article with the clinical detachment of an engineer reviewing a completed demolition report. The fallout from the Ice and Snow Festival had been swift, merciless, and entirely legal. Marcus Vance's hubris had left a paper trail so wide and undeniable that the state attorney's office had no choice but to make an example of him. Indicted for falsifying public records, extortion under the color of law, and multiple counts of perjury, Vance was currently awaiting trial without bail. He had permanently lost his badge, his pension, and any illusion of authority. The corporate fallout had been equally devastating. Alpine Vista Holdings and its parent conglomerate, represented by Chloe, had been formally stripped of their investment licenses within the county. The town council, terrified of the massive class action lawsuit Elias could have legally brought against the municipality, had desperately attempted to offer him a multi-million-dollar out-of-court settlement. They had expected the gritty veteran to take the payout and walk away. They hadn't understood the fundamental nature of the man they were dealing with. Elias Thorne had refused the millions. He was a master woodworker. He had enough money to buy his timber, feed his dog, and keep his cabin warm. A massive financial windfall wouldn't have fixed the town. It would have only drained the public schools and the fire department. Instead, utilizing Richard Caldwell, a ferocious civil rights attorney from Denver who had taken the case pro bono the second he saw the ice wall video, Elias had demanded a binding consent decree. He forced the town council to rewrite the municipal zoning and enforcement codes entirely. The vague public nuisance bylaws Vance had weaponized were permanently stricken from the charter. An independent oversight committee, comprised of local business owners including Arthur and Martha, was established to review any future property seizures. The only financial compensation Elias had accepted was a meticulously calculated sum of $12,000. He had used it to completely replace the cracked Pelican case and the ruined lenses of a certain young AV technician, donating the rest to the local animal shelter where Dr. Gable operated. Elias hadn't wanted a lottery ticket. He had only wanted the foundation repaired. Folding the newspaper and tucking it under his arm, Elias continued his walk. As he approached Martha's hearth, the familiar scent of cinnamon and yeast greeted him. The heavy wooden door swung open, and Martha stepped out, holding a small paper bag. She didn't make a grand spectacle. She simply smiled, her eyes crinkling warmly at the corners. "Morning, Elias." "Morning, Valor," she said gently, tossing a freshly baked, unseasoned beef sausage to the German shepherd. Valor caught it deftly in mid-air, his tail wagging in slow, sweeping arcs of appreciation. "Morning, Martha." "The structural reinforcements on your back deck holding up to the snow?" Elias asked, his tone easy and conversational. "Solid as a rock, Elias, just like the man who built it." She gave him a knowing look before stepping back inside to tend to the morning rush. A sudden, harsh scrape of metal on asphalt echoed down the street as a municipal snowplow dropped its heavy blade too quickly. It was the exact kind of sharp, percussive noise that had sent Elias into a spiraling panic attack a month prior. Elias stopped. He waited for the adrenaline spike, for the tightening of his chest, for the suffocating dust of the desert to cloud his vision. It didn't come. He looked down. Valor hadn't pressed against his leg. The dog was simply looking up at him, his silver-dusted muzzle tilted slightly, waiting for the command to keep walking. The phantom threat had failed to materialize. For years, Elias had operated under the assumption that his survival depended entirely on his own hypervigilance, an isolating fortress of discipline designed to keep the world out. But standing in the square, surrounded by the people who had linked arms to protect him when the fortress walls had been breached, Elias realized a profound truth. He wasn't alone. The community wasn't a threat to be managed. It was a load-bearing structure he could actually lean on. Further down the plaza, a young man was setting up a small PA system for a local weekend farmers market. It was Leo. The 24-year-old technician looked rested, wearing his signature oversized beanie, adjusting cables with practiced efficiency. Next to his mixing board sat a brand-new, impeccably pristine Pelican protective case. Leo looked up, spotting Elias and the large German shepherd. The young man stopped what he was doing. He didn't shout a greeting across the plaza. Instead, he stood up straight, offered a two-finger salute from his brow, and smiled. A genuine, unburdened smile of a man who no longer had to look over his shoulder while doing his job. Elias returned the nod. As they reached the edge of the downtown sector, the pavement transitioned into a winding, snow-packed hiking trail that led up toward the foothills of the Rockies. The morning sun was climbing higher, casting a brilliant, blindingly pure light over the snow. A woman walking in the opposite direction paused on the trail. It was Sarah. She was off the clock, dressed in a bright red winter parka instead of her drab municipal cardigan, holding a leash attached to a small, scruffy terrier rescue. When she saw Elias, the tired, bureaucratic exhaustion that used to define her face was completely absent. She looked radiant, empowered by the knowledge that her quiet act of courage in the dark alley had fundamentally changed her town for the better. "Mr. Thorne," Sarah greeted warmly, stepping aside to let the large German shepherd pass. "Sarah," Elias replied, a rare, genuine smile breaking through the weathered lines of his face. "It's a beautiful morning for a walk." "It truly is," she agreed. Looking around at the quiet, peaceful town, the air just feels cleaner. Elias nodded in silent agreement. He tipped his head slightly in respect, gently tugged Valor's leash, and continued up the trail. The winter sun beat down on the path, melting the topmost layer of frost into glittering droplets of water. Elias Thorne walked with a steady, unhurried cadence, the heavy green booties of his best friend padding softly beside him. He looked out over the valley, at the smoke rising from the chimneys and the solid, enduring architecture of the town he called home. He had spent his life dismantling threats and reinforcing broken structures, carrying the heavy, icy weight of betrayal and loss. But as he walked under the radiant Colorado sun, feeling the solid, unquestioning loyalty of the dog at his side, Elias finally understood the physics of healing. You didn't need fire to destroy the cold rot of corruption. You didn't need violence to defeat a bully. All it took was the quiet, immovable strength of the truth, standing shoulder to shoulder with the people you loved, to melt the thickest, coldest ice in the world. The story of Elias and Valor reminds us that true healing rarely happens in isolation. We often build heavy walls to protect ourselves from a harsh world, choosing to fight our quiet battles entirely alone. Yet, This story reveals a beautiful truth. God's grace often manifests not in grand, sweeping interventions, but through the quiet courage of a neighbor, the steadfast loyalty of a companion, and a community willing to link arms and stand by your side when you need it most. In your own daily struggles, remember that you do not have to carry the weight of the world by yourself. If this message brought you comfort, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone unexpectedly stood up for you? Please subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. May you find the courage to let others help carry your burdens, and may God bless your days with profound, unwavering peace.